It all starts in a courtroom, a place that's supposed to stand for truth, fairness, and justice. But when a powerful judge tries to humiliate a quiet black man in front of a jury thinking no one will challenge him, he has no idea that this man isn't here to beg for mercy. He's here to change everything. What unfolds next is a collision of pride, silence, buried corruption, and the kind of reckoning that doesn't knock, it walks straight through the door. And let me tell you, by the time the truth shows up, it won't be asking for permission. So, before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from and what time you hit play. Drop a comment down below. We read every one. And if you believe in justice, truth, and stories that shake the system, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this with someone who still believes a voice can change everything. Now, let's begin. The old courthouse in downtown Savannah stood like a monument to another time, its brick faded, its iron railings rusting, and the air around it heavy, as if the building itself remembered every verdict ever spoken inside. On the steps leading up to the entrance, Franklin Pierce adjusted the collar of his coat and paused for a breath that didn't come easy. The southern sun was warm, but his hands were cold, tucked deep into his pockets like they might shield him from what waited beyond those heavy oak doors. Inside, the wood creaked and the walls seemed to breathe. Time didn't move here. It hovered. The hallway smelled faintly of floor polish and something older papers left too long, decisions left unchecked. Franklin walked slowly, nodding at no one, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the dull murmur of others waiting for their moment to be judged. He had stood on many stages in his life, union halls, church basements, rally podiums, but this one was different. This stage didn't want his voice, it wanted his silence. As he pushed open the door to courtroom 2B, the hush hit him like a wall. Wooden pews lined the space, every eye turning briefly, curiously, then looking away. The judge wasn't in yet, but her shadow already was. At the defense table, Monique sat straight-backed, her legal pad, open pen, still lips pressed in a line she wore only when she was bracing herself. She didn't look up at him immediately. She didn't need to. "You okay?" she asked softly, not turning her head. Franklin nodded once, then took his seat beside her. "I've been in tighter corners," he muttered, trying to believe it. She offered no reply, just slid a folder toward him and said, "They filed a motion to limit testimony. Judge already approved it. Witness list cut in half." He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. A bailiff entered and called the room to order, but there was no urgency in his voice, just the repetition of a job done too many times. Then Judge Clayton Ramsey stepped out from behind the chamber door, black robe flowing, his shoulders broad and stiff, with the weight of 40 years on the bench. His jaw was square, his stare narrow, and his tone clipped when he finally spoke. "Let's get this over with," he said, as he settled into his chair, not looking at the defense table, not acknowledging the man whose life had been rearranged to fit a charge that didn't hold up outside the paperwork it came in. Franklin studied the judge, eyes, steady face, unreadable. There was no fear there, just recognition. He'd seen men like Ramsey before in courthouses, boardrooms, newsrooms. Men who didn't yell, didn't threaten, but erased people just the same, stroke by stroke. The court clerk began reading the docket. The charge was simple: resisting arrest. The words sounded clean, official, unshaken. But behind them lived a truth dirtier than any document could admit. Franklin had been pulled from a sidewalk, hands raised, mouth closed, and told he was obstructing a lawful order. That order had never been given. The footage showed as much, but the footage had a habit of disappearing. Judge Ramsey cleared his throat and looked directly at Franklin for the first time. "Mr. Pierce," he said, voice smooth but edged, "I see you've brought your daughter to argue your innocence." He smiled thinly, no warmth behind it. "Let's just hope she can keep this from turning into another spectacle." The gallery shifted uneasily. Monique didn't blink. "With respect, Your Honor," she said, voice calm and controlled, "we're here for the truth, not theater." He leaned back in his chair, tapping a knuckle against the armrest. "That remains to be seen." Franklin wanted to speak, wanted to stand and say something real about how justice wasn't meant to feel, like walking a tightrope about how the law should protect, not punish, but he didn't, not yet. Instead, he glanced to his left, to where the jury sat, just beginning to form their impressions. Some eyes were kind, most were tired, one or two already looked away. And that more than anything told him what he needed to know. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about surviving the grind until the truth found a way through the cracks. The prosecution rose next, a younger man in a slick suit, voice full of confidence he hadn't yet earned. He referred to Franklin as a repeat agitator, citing incidents from decades past peaceful protests, arrests never charged, rallies labeled disruptive. This is a pattern, he said, pacing with a practiced rhythm. Mr. Pierce has made it his life's work to oppose order, to challenge authority, to incite chaos under the guise of activism. Franklin breathed in slowly. He didn't clench his fists, he didn't flinch. But in the base of his spine, something ancient stirred, something like heat, something like weariness that had long ago hardened into patience. When Monique stood to respond, her voice didn't rise. It deepened. My father was pulled to the ground by 2 officers without provocation. He complied. He asked questions. He did not resist. There is footage. There are witnesses. And yet here we are arguing about whether he deserved what happened, rather than whether it should have happened at all. Her words held stillness, not rage. It was the stillness of a woman who had grown up watching justice move slowly and silence move faster. Judge Ramsey didn't look impressed. He glanced at the clock on the far wall, then back to Monique. "You'll need to keep it brief. I don't have time for personal history." She nodded, once lips tight. "Neither do we, Your Honor." Outside the window, sunlight slipped through the blinds in narrow lines across the floor. Dust drifted in the air, barely visible but present. The kind of dust you don't notice until the light catches it just right. Franklin watched it float, watched it settle, and for a moment he imagined each particle as a voice that had tried to speak here once, and each one had fallen the same way, unheard, uncounted, dismissed. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. In that moment he simply sat, breathing steady shoulders, square, his daughter's words hanging in the air like something sacred. The courtroom didn't shake. No thunder cracked, but something had shifted, quiet, small, unspoken. And when Judge Ramsey called for a recess, it was the first time Franklin noticed him not looking so sure of the ending anymore. And that in itself was a start. The second day in court began without ceremony, just the dull hum of fluorescent lights flickering above, and the scratch of pens from a half-sleeping clerk trying to look alert. Franklin sat at the defense table with his hands folded, his thumb tracing a slow circle across the back of his opposite hand, a motion he wasn't aware of, but one that had returned from old habits, from the years when he waited on decisions made by men who never looked him in the eye. The courtroom smelled like dust and recycled air, the kind that settles on your skin and makes you feel older than you are. Across the aisle, the young prosecutor adjusted his tie and offered a smirk too casual for a man about to present someone else's life as evidence of guilt. Monique leaned closer to her father, her voice low, barely more than breath. "They're planning to use only the trimmed footage," she whispered, not needing to say more. Franklin's eyes didn't leave the floor. "You saw it?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Yes. They cut out the first 12 seconds. The part that actually shows the cop grabbing the woman." He didn't respond at first, just inhaled deeply as if trying to pull air into a space inside his chest that had long since collapsed. Then he said, "And they think that's justice." Judge Ramsey entered through the side door with that same quiet arrogance he wore, like a second skin, not a robe of justice, but a cloak of control stitched together by years of knowing no one ever questioned him and lived to win the argument. His gavel struck once, sharp and thin, like a nail being driven into something already cracked. "Prosecution," he said, with a nod, barely glancing toward Monique. "You may proceed." The prosecutor stood and called for the evidence display to begin. A screen flickered to life behind him, and the grainy footage played a phone video, shaky, zoomed in, capturing a moment that told a story, just not the whole one. On the screen, Franklin appeared mid-motion, arms raised slightly as he moved between a police officer and a young woman who was backing away. But there was no audio, no context, just images, and in absence of truth, the mind creates its own meaning. The prosecutor paused the video at the moment Franklin's hands touched the officer's arm. "Here," he said, confidently, "is the defendant initiating physical interference with law enforcement." He stepped aside, letting the silence do what spin could not. Franklin said nothing, but his jaw flexed once. The room held its breath. Then Monique rose, her heels steady on the wood floor, her voice composed but pointed. "Your Honor, the defense challenges the authenticity of this footage." Ramsey raised an eyebrow. "Explain." She gestured toward the screen. "This video has been selectively edited. The initial portion of the recording, the moment showing the officer's aggression toward the civilian, has been omitted." The judge leaned back, folding his hands. "Do you have proof?" She nodded. We intend to introduce the full, unedited recording captured by the original witness who is present in court today and willing to testify. Ramsey glanced toward the prosecutor, who stood immediately. Objection, Your Honor. This witness was not submitted during pre-trial. Ramsey turned his eyes back to Monique. Why was this not disclosed earlier? She answered plainly. Because the prosecution already had access to this witness and deliberately chose not to follow up. The judge exhaled through his nose and shook his head slightly like a man tired of games, though he was the one writing the rules. Objection sustained. The witness will not be allowed to testify at this time. And just like that, the air in the courtroom grew colder. Franklin didn't move, but he closed his eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to retreat just far enough to collect himself. Monique returned to her seat slowly. They don't want the whole truth, she said under her breath. They never have. He looked at her, then eyes heavy. So we give it anyway, he replied. Even if they close their ears, we make sure they feel it. Across the room, the jurors watched, mostly silent, mostly still, but one woman, somewhere in her 60s, pearl earrings and reading glasses, scribbled something quickly onto a yellow notepad, then looked up, her brow furrowed, not in confusion, but something closer to suspicion. It was enough. Enough to remind Franklin that not all eyes were blind, not all silence was consent. The judge called a brief recess. The moment the gavel fell, the courtroom murmured like a radio tuning between stations. Franklin stayed, seated, his hands still folded, but his eyes now scanned the crowd. He saw a man near the back, brown jacket, thick glasses, calloused hands folded over a worn cap in his lap. It was Luis Estrada, the janitor who had seen everything from the sidewalk. They locked eyes briefly, and Luis offered the smallest of nods, the kind of gesture men pass between them when they know they're walking through something heavy together. Monique sat down beside him and opened her laptop, scrolling through files. Her fingers moved fast, but her voice was soft. If they won't let him speak, we find another way. The footage was uploaded to a cloud drive. I've got the original file and the metadata. Time-stamped, geo-verified. Franklin didn't smile, but something in his posture eased. Not confidence, not relief, just steadiness. Do it smart, he said. Not loud, just real. They didn't speak again until the courtroom reconvened. When the recess ended, the judge re-entered with the same stern cadence in his gait. The prosecution leaned back in his chair, smug, confident, unaware that the ground beneath him had just shifted. Franklin looked forward, unmoving, silent, and as the judge called the session back to order, there was something different in the way the room breathed. Not hope, not yet. But maybe the memory of it. Outside, the clouds had thickened, softening the sunlight into a dim gold that filtered through the blinds and streaked across the courtroom floor like quiet resistance. Inside, nothing had changed officially. The video remained cropped. The witness silenced. The judge in charge. But beneath it all, just under the surface of polished wood and rigid rules, a current had begun to shift, subtle, steady, inevitable. And Franklin, sitting there in the stillness, felt it first, not as a victory, but as proof he hadn't imagined the weight pressing against him all these years. It had a name, it had a face, and now finally it had something to lose. The morning after the video ruling, Monique sat at the defense table with a manila folder spread open like a map to something fragile, something long buried but still pulsing beneath the surface. Outside, rain tapped gently against the tall courthouse windows, a slow, rhythmic pattern that seemed to count time differently inside these walls. The air carried a weight, not of noise or motion, but of waiting, the kind of waiting that settles in bones when truth is close, but not quite close enough to touch. Franklin didn't speak as she sifted through the documents, just watched her work with a patience carved from years of repetition. The corners of the papers were soft-handled too many times, some slightly smudged by ink that had bled under pressure by hands that had trembled, while printing truths no one had asked to read. I need to submit this now, she murmured, her eyes scanning the last page, lips barely moving. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. Then do it, he said. If we're going to walk through fire, might as well bring matches. The clerk looked up when she approached the bench face, expressionless pen hovering mid-air like it didn't want to commit to what came next. Monique handed the supplemental evidence folder across the desk. Motion to review historical sentencing trends under Judge Ramsey, she said clearly, professionally, without a hint of the weight behind her word. The clerk took the folder, placed it on top of a small stack, already leaning uncomfortably, then offered the faintest glance toward the door of chambers. He'll see it, she said flatly, then turned away. Back at the table, Franklin rubbed his palms together slowly, his eyes drawn to the wood grain in front of him, not for meaning, just for something to ground him. "You found the right ones?" he asked softly. Monique didn't answer immediately. She looked at him, and in that pause was everything she didn't want to say too soon. 14 cases, Dad. All black men. All sentenced by Ramsey. All appealed. All denied. And every single one of them shows key evidence, either missing, blocked, or ruled inadmissible. Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her fingertips, tapping the table once, then twice, then stopping as if she'd caught herself. Franklin leaned back slightly, his shoulders square but tired. "You think that'll matter to this jury?" he asked. Monique didn't hesitate this time. "I don't know," she said plainly, "but it should matter to the record." That sentence sat between them for a moment, a line drawn in quiet defiance. Behind them, the courtroom murmured to life again, as others filed in the familiar shuffle of shoes on linoleum, the soft cough of someone too nervous to clear their throat properly. Franklin glanced at the people seated in the gallery, familiar faces, unfamiliar ones, a mix of community and curiosity, of quiet support and quiet doubt. He saw a woman holding a notepad with corners folded back, a man with a hearing aid leaning toward the aisle for a better view. It struck him then how many people had come, not for him, not even for the case, but for what might crack open through it. When Judge Ramsey entered the room, quieted fast. His robe looked a shade darker today, maybe from the rain, maybe just the light, but his posture hadn't changed. It was the posture of a man used to presiding, not listening. "Counsel," he said, barely glancing at Monique, "I see you filed new materials this morning." She stood calm and precise. "Yes, Your Honor. A motion for judicial pattern review based on prior case records." He raised an eyebrow, almost amused. "This court doesn't conduct reviews based on statistical theories." She didn't blink. "These aren't theories, sir. They're facts. Documented, dated, and signed." He leaned forward slightly, folding his hands. "This is a criminal proceeding, not a classroom. You want to discuss reform, take it to the State House." Monique's voice didn't rise, but it sharpened. "This motion is not about reform. It's about recognition. Recognition that the pattern surrounding this bench is not coincidental, it is consistent." The judge blinked slowly, like someone trying not to react before they've decided if it's worth the effort. "Motion is noted," he said with a shrug, "but will not be considered admissible without direct evidence linking these claims to the case at hand." Franklin felt it like a gust, not loud but strong, the moment a door you thought was opening just quietly slammed into your chest. His daughter returned to her seat, her face unchanged, but he knew her too well. He leaned toward her and whispered, "He thinks he's untouchable." She didn't look at him. "So did the walls at Jericho," she replied. The prosecution stood to object to the inclusion of any historical context, citing irrelevance and jury prejudice. Ramsey nodded before the words even landed. "Sustained," he said, smooth as butter over a blade. "Let's stay focused on the present." And in that sentence, the past was erased again, not forgotten, just conveniently shelved. Franklin sat back, arms crossed, breath slow and measured. He looked toward the jury, toward the rows of faces he'd begun to learn. Some looked away, some watched him. One, a younger black man in his late 20s, held his gaze just long enough to nod. Not an agreement, but an acknowledgement. "A quiet human, I see you." Outside, the rain had stopped, but the gray still clung to the windows like a second skin. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed again, steady and soulless. The paper trail Monique had handed over now sat unopened on the clerk's desk, heavy with history, dense with names that never got their day in court, or if they did never got to speak in full. The judge moved on. The prosecution resumed. Words filled the air, but the words no longer held the same weight. Something had changed in the stillness, not in outcome, not in power, but in attention. And sometimes attention is where cracks begin. Franklin rested his elbows on the table and folded his hands beneath his chin. He didn't feel anger, not exactly. What he felt was something colder, quieter, the sensation of being heard without being believed. It was familiar, too familiar. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't carrying it alone. And that realization, as small as it was, sat with him as he looked back toward that manila folder, still sealed, still waiting to be read, not by the judge, not even by the clerk, but maybe, just maybe, by history. The courtroom had barely settled when Monique rose to her feet again, her motions steady but deliberate, like someone crossing a frozen lake with full knowledge of what lay beneath. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it didn't need to be. It carried with it the weight of something too important to rush. Your Honor, she began, folding her hands in front of her. The defense respectfully requests that the court hear testimony from a witness not previously listed, but whose relevance is both immediate and necessary. There was a pause, not the kind that begs permission, but the kind that demands attention. Judge Ramsey didn't look up right away. He adjusted his glasses slowly, as if trying to decide whether this request was worth acknowledging or just another procedural pebble in his shoe. You know the rules of submission, counselor, he said at last, tone dry, unmoved. Witnesses not declared during pre-trial are inadmissible unless under exceptional circumstance. Monique nodded, unwavering. This is exceptional, she said quietly, and so is what she knows. Across the room, Franklin sat with his fingers pressed together beneath his chin, watching the exchange with the kind of stillness that doesn't ask for patience but practices it anyway. He didn't know who the witness was. Not exactly. Monique had kept that part close, not out of secrecy, but necessity. The less said, the safer they stayed. But he trusted her judgment more than most people trusted facts. Judge Ramsey let the silence linger a few seconds longer, as if the delay itself might discourage the idea. Name, he asked finally. Viola Baxter. Monique replied. Former court transcriptionist under your jurisdiction. 33 years in service, retired 3 years ago. The judge's eyes flicked up for the first time, his expression not changing but hardening slightly around the edges. And what exactly does Miss Baxter claim to offer this court? Monique's reply was simple. Memory. Records. Pages that never made it into the official archive. And a reason to listen that goes beyond procedure. That last line settled like smoke across the room. The gallery didn't stir. They'd learned by now that movement could draw attention you didn't want. But something shifted in the air, a quiet tightening, like the breath people hold when they know something real is about to enter a space, usually reserved for fiction. A side door opened gently near the front of the courtroom, and from it emerged a woman, small in frame but upright in posture, with gray curls pinned in place, and a cardigan the color of old denim wrapped snug around her shoulders. Viola Baxter walked with careful steps, not hesitant but grounded, like a woman who'd carried other people's words long enough to know the damage they could do. She didn't look at the judge. She didn't need to. Her eyes searched for Monique, found her. And something passed between them, not gratitude, not relief, but recognition. She took the witness seat without fuss, placed her purse on the floor beside her, and folded her hands in her lap with the kind of quiet dignity that belongs to people who've survived rooms like this without ever once being invited to speak. The bailiff swore her in his voice, respectful but quick, and when Monique approached her, tone softened. Miss Baxter, how many years did you work as a court transcriptionist in Chatham County? Viola smiled faintly, the kind of smile that says more than it shows. 33, she replied. Started in '86, back when we used reel-to-reel for depositions and typewriters for closing arguments. The room offered a faint murmur of polite surprise, but she didn't acknowledge it. And during those 33 years, Monique continued, how many judges did you work under? Viola tilted her head slightly. 7 officially. 4 who made it to retirement. And 1, she said, glancing now toward the bench for the first time, who believed retirement was optional. Ramsey said nothing. His jaw didn't move, but his hand had shifted slightly on the armrest of his chair, fingers flexed as though they were deciding between silence and objection. Monique continued her questions, precise but human. In your work, were you ever instructed to edit, omit, or alter court records? Viola's lips pressed into a thin line before parting. Not directly, but there were times when full transcripts were marked for summary, which isn't the same as redacting, but not far off when you know what's being summarized. She paused, letting the room feel the edges of that implication. And it didn't happen with everyone. Just certain kinds of cases. Certain kinds of defendants. Monique nodded, her voice still low. Did any of those cases involve my father, Franklin Pierce? Viola's eyes softened as she looked at him. I remember his voice, she said. Firm, not angry. Clear. He asked why he was being arrested, and the officer said something about trespassing on a public sidewalk. That was in the draft transcript. But it never made it into the official court record. A beat passed. That line was crossed out. For the first time, Franklin looked up and locked eyes with her. He hadn't remembered the words. Not exactly, but hearing them spoken aloud, hearing someone else say them, felt like being handed back a part of himself that had been confiscated, mislabeled, and filed away under a name that wasn't his. Ramsey cleared his throat, sharp and shallow. "Miss Baxter," he said, his voice clipped, "are you suggesting that this court intentionally modified public records to alter the narrative of a criminal case?" Viola didn't flinch. "I'm saying the truth didn't always survive the editing process." She turned back to Monique. "And I came here today because I'm done keeping that to myself." No one moved. The gallery remained still but alert. The jurors didn't look away. One of them leaned forward slightly, as if the words had cracked open something he didn't realize he'd been protecting. Monique stepped back gently. "No further questions, Your Honor." Viola Baxter remained seated a moment longer, not waiting to be dismissed, just existing in full view, in full truth. Then she gathered her purse, stood with care, and walked slowly back through the door she'd entered, each step echoing just enough to be remembered. And as it closed behind her, Franklin sat with his eyes on the door, not smiling, not frowning, just breathing deeply, evenly, as if something in the room had finally been made whole. Not justice, not yet, but honesty. And for now, that was enough. There are stories that never make it into the official record, moments too quiet or too personal for the paperwork to catch, and Franklin Pierce had lived through more than his share of them. The hallway outside courtroom 2B was quiet now, except for the low murmur of footsteps passing behind closed doors and the occasional squeak of a rolling file cart on the aging tile floor. He stood with his hand resting on the edge of the window frame, staring through the rain-streaked glass at a bench across the street where an old man fed pigeons without urgency, like someone who had long since stopped rushing for anything. Monique stood a few feet behind him, arms crossed her blazer, clinging slightly to her arms from the humidity left behind by the passing storm. She didn't speak at first, just watched him, the way his shoulders rose and fell slowly, the way he seemed more present in silence than he ever was in conversation. "You okay?" she asked gently, though the question felt small next to the weight hanging in the air. He nodded once but didn't turn. "I keep thinking about your grandfather," he said. "How he spent 4 years trying to clear his name for something he didn't do, and when they finally dropped the charges, they never even said sorry." Monique stepped closer, the sound of her shoes soft against the floor, like she was trying not to wake something that had been sleeping too long. "You never really told me what happened," she said. He finally looked over, eyes tired but steady. "I didn't want you carrying it," he replied. "I thought if I held it long enough, maybe it would lose its edge." He smiled faintly, but it didn't touch his eyes. Turns out, history doesn't dull, it just waits. They walked back toward the defense table without another word, the silence between them, not empty, but full of everything they'd never needed to say out loud. Inside the courtroom, the next session hadn't started yet. The lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a pale glow over the empty jury box, and the polished wood that had been cleaned so often it no longer looked touched by human hands. Franklin took his seat slowly, the cushion groaning beneath him like it recognized the weight of someone used to being judged. Monique pulled a folded sheet of paper from her briefcase, older, slightly yellowed, a copy of a court summary from 1987. "This is from Judge Ramsey's first year on the bench," she said, voice low. "A wrongful conviction case. The defendant was 17, black, convicted on testimony that was later recanted. Still served 11 years. Franklin took the paper without speaking, his eyes scanning the typed lines like someone looking at a photo of themselves from long ago, familiar and unfamiliar all at once. "He's the reason I left the public defender's office," Monique added. "I read that case file at 3 in the morning and couldn't sleep for days." Franklin set the paper down slowly. "How deep did you go?" he asked. She met his eyes. "Deep enough to know it's not just a pattern, it's a practice." She paused, then added, "And deep enough to know we're not the first to try and stop him." That last line landed like a quiet warning, but Franklin didn't flinch. "You afraid?" he asked. Monique tilted her head. "I've been afraid since the first day I walked into law school and realized I'd be arguing against men who already made up their minds." They didn't speak again for a while, letting the space around them settle into something close to stillness. The gallery was half full now, some faces familiar, others new, and one a woman in her 70s with tightly coiled silver hair, and a church pin on her lapel kept her hands folded neatly over a small Bible she didn't open. She didn't need to. She wasn't here for scripture, she was here to witness. Across the room, the bailiff adjusted a clipboard and muttered something into a lapel mic, then nodded toward the side door as it creaked open slowly. Judge Ramsey entered with the same expression he always wore, not disapproval, not arrogance, but something colder, like indifference dipped in formality. He didn't sit immediately. He stood behind the bench and looked out across the room, as if counting the seconds it would take to regain control. "We will proceed," he said, voice sharp as stone. "Counsel, keep your arguments grounded in present facts. This is not a trial for ghosts." Monique stood calm but firm. "With respect, Your Honor," she said, "history isn't a ghost when it leaves fingerprints on every step forward." The judge narrowed his eyes, but said nothing, and she continued, laying 3 documents on the table before her. These records trace a consistent suppression of material evidence across multiple cases under this bench's purview. Not by accident, not by policy failure, but by direct decision. She turned toward the jury now, her voice softening slightly. "My father's case is not the first time the system has failed. It's just the first time it was caught on tape, almost." Franklin watched as one of the jurors shifted in his seat, crossed his arms tighter, and then uncrossed them again. The kind of motion that betrays a person trying to act neutral, but already feeling something different underneath. The paper trail Monique had exposed earlier now had names and faces to go with it, and though the judge hadn't allowed them all into evidence, the words had been spoken, and once spoken truth has a way of staying in the room, whether it's invited or not. As the session closed, Ramsey's gavel fell with a sound louder than it needed to be, not because it had to silence the room, but because he needed to remind himself that he still could. Franklin stood slowly, one hand resting on the table before he turned toward the back of the courtroom. He saw a man he hadn't seen in years, a retired teacher from the neighborhood now limping slightly, nodding once in silent approval. And in that small moment, as rain returned outside and streaked the windows in soft, slanted lines, Franklin Pierce understood something he hadn't quite put into words before, that the past, when denied, becomes something toxic, but when exposed, even if only partly, it can begin to breathe again. And breathing, at least for today, was enough. There are some things you don't show until the room is quiet enough to hear them, and that morning, as the hum of voices faded into a silence you could almost feel pressing against your skin, Monique reached into her briefcase and withdrew a manila envelope that looked at first glance like nothing at all. It was slightly worn at the edges, creased where it had been folded shut, with care sealed in a way that said it had waited a long time to be opened, not out of fear, but out of knowing exactly when its truth would matter most. She laid it flat on the defense table, her fingers resting gently on top, not to protect it but to steady her own breath. Franklin sat beside her, eyes fixed on the envelope without blinking, his hands motionless now, as if even the smallest movement might shatter the moment. "Is that it?" he asked quietly, the words barely audible but heavy, with the kind of weight that only builds when you've spent years collecting truth like loose change, hoping one day you'll have enough to buy your way back into justice. Monique nodded once her jaw set. "It's everything," she replied, "and it's verified." Across the courtroom, Judge Ramsey leaned forward, slightly curiosity flickering behind the veil of practiced detachment. His tone was measured, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Counselor, what exactly are you attempting to introduce?" Monique stood the envelope still in front of her and met his gaze without flinching. "This document," she said, "contains evidence obtained, legally reviewed and authenticated by federal agents during an ongoing investigation into judicial misconduct and systemic suppression of evidence." There was a pause, not quite disbelief, but something colder, something closer to calculation. Ramsey shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping once against the edge of the bench, the sound small but sharp like the first crack in a window under pressure. "Unless this evidence directly pertains to the defendant's case, it is inadmissible," he stated. "We are not here to relitigate rumors." Monique's voice remained steady. "This is not rumor, Your Honor. This is documented, time-stamped, and tied to the pattern of decisions directly impacting this courtroom, including this trial." The envelope sat between them like a live wire, unassuming in appearance but radiating tension in every direction. The jury leaned forward almost unconsciously, sensing the shift in tone, the change in air, as if something had entered the room that couldn't be walked back. Ramsey narrowed his eyes. "If you proceed with this line, Counselor, you may be held in contempt should the materials be deemed outside the scope of this hearing." Monique didn't blink. "I understand," she said, "but I won't be the one out of order if the truth stays buried." Franklin inhaled slowly, hands folded tight in his lap. He felt the pressure building behind his ribs, not panic but memory of the time he tried to present a recording during a town hall meeting and was shouted down before it ever reached the speakers. Of the look on his late brother's face when they lost their first appeal, and the transcript came back missing entire paragraphs. Of all the moments he thought maybe justice wasn't broken, maybe it had just never been built for people like them in the first place. The gallery remained silent but alert. A woman in the third row clutched her handbag tighter, not out of fear but out of something more tender hope, maybe, though she wouldn't have called it that out loud. Ramsey exhaled, slow and controlled, then gestured. "You may proceed, but if this turns into a circus, I will clear this courtroom." Monique picked up the envelope, carefully broke the seal with a quiet motion that somehow felt louder than the judge's gavel, and withdrew the first document with deliberate care. It was a receipt dated, signed, and traced, showing a wire transfer from Southeast Incarceration Holdings LLC to an account under the name Clayton E. Ramsey. The amount was large, but it wasn't the number that mattered. It was the purpose retention bonus for judicial cooperation in expedited sentencing recommendations. A murmur rose low and startled, but Monique didn't pause. She laid the second document flat, a printed series of internal emails between county clerks and the district attorney's office, highlighting key phrases. In yellow flagged non-essential footage, prioritize body cam clips that favor compliance. Narratives omit conflicting witness statements. The words weren't screaming, but they didn't have to. They said enough to bruise every person who ever believed their court transcript reflected what had actually happened. Finally, she held up the third paper, a spreadsheet showing 14 cases, each one involving a black defendant, each one prosecuted under Ramsey's court, and each one marked by a pattern of evidentiary exclusion, inflated sentencing, or outright dismissal of key testimony. At the bottom of the page, one line stood alone, highlighted in bold: Pierce Franklin evidence pending. Similar structure to 1994-2006. Ramsey's hand tightened around the base of his gavel, but he didn't bring it down. His expression didn't change, but his silence deepened, and deep silence in a courtroom like this is louder than any verdict. Franklin closed his eyes briefly, not to hide, not to retreat, but to feel the moment settle into him like a stone dropped in water. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't spectacle. This was truth documented and laid bare, not shouted, not dramatized, just spoken. Monique's voice, when it returned, was softer. "This isn't about tearing down a man," she said. "It's about standing up in the space where so many others have been told to sit down." Her gaze moved to the jury now. "We're not asking you to carry the weight of the past, only to recognize when the present is shaped by what's been ignored too long." The room didn't move. The jurors didn't whisper. The gallery didn't fidget. Even Ramsey, who had spoken so often and so decisively now, sat back in his chair as if unsure what to say next. And the envelope, once opened, sat on the table like something sacred, not because it was magic, but because it had waited so long to be believed. Franklin looked at his daughter, not with surprise, not with pride exactly, but with a kind of still respect that comes only when you see someone walk through fire without flinching. She didn't meet his eyes right away, but when she did, there was no victory in her face, only focus, only purpose, and the kind of quiet courage that doesn't need applause to know it's doing what matters. Outside, the clouds had finally broken, and a shaft of light fell through the high windows, catching the dust in the air and making it visible like tiny truths suspended in motion, finally seen for what they were. When the courtroom doors closed that morning, it didn't feel like a room returning to order. It felt like a dam holding its breath. The silence wasn't clean. It pulsed tight and watchful, like something invisible shifting just beneath the polished surface of routine. Judge Ramsey sat still in his chair, spine straight as ever, robe neat as a uniform. But something had changed in the space between his brow and his mouth, a flicker of strain barely visible but present. His eyes scanned the courtroom slower than usual, as if measuring what had just been said against the limits of his own control. Franklin could feel it from where he sat. He didn't need to speak or move or look for cues. The room had changed temperature, not in degrees, but in pressure, like before a storm. Monique remained standing beside the defense table, her fingers resting lightly on the sealed envelope, now lying open like a piece of testimony that had waited years to breathe. She didn't speak, and she didn't need to. For the first time since the trial began, it wasn't just the jury watching her, it was Ramsey. He cleared his throat once, not out of discomfort, but to remind the room that he still owned the air inside it. "Let's return to the matter at hand," he said, voice-clipped tone, leaning hard on procedure. "We are not here to conduct a federal inquisition." His gavel tapped once softer than usual, like he was trying not to acknowledge the weight it had lost. Franklin leaned slightly toward Monique and said quietly, "He's not rattled, but he's listening." She gave a faint nod. "A crack is still a crack. The next hour unfolded with a strange tension, formalities stacked over truths too large to fit inside the rules being recited. The prosecution resumed, with rehearsed determination, sticking close to the original narrative, repeating phrases that now felt brittle and worn. The jury listened, but the shift in their posture betrayed them. One woman kept glancing at the defense table. A man in the back row scribbled more notes than he had during the entire first day. Eyes moved with new rhythm, not faster, just more deliberate, like they'd started weighing every word instead of just receiving it. Outside, the sky had begun to lighten, but the courtroom lights remained harsh and indifferent, casting the same sharp shadows across the floor. Franklin focused on the dust suspended in the beams of light, how it moved slow and silent, proof that even in stillness something was always shifting. His thoughts drifted to a time when he stood in a different courtroom, younger, less guarded, watching a friend take the fall for a mistake he didn't make. Back then, he thought silence protected you. Now he knew silence only protected power. Ramsey called for a brief recess, his voice steady, but his eyes didn't linger the way they used to. He rose from the bench slowly, his hand bracing against the wood like he needed it, not for balance but for control. The gavel echoed once more, and the courtroom released its breath in small, quiet ways. A cough here, a chair shifting there, the low rustle of papers and fabric and lives being adjusted between moments. Franklin stood slowly, stretching the stiffness from his knees, and walked with Monique into the hallway just outside the courtroom. The walls were painted beige, the kind of color that promises neutrality but delivers resignation. A security guard leaned against the far wall, pretending not to listen, but Franklin caught the way his eyes flicked toward them when he thought no one noticed. "It's happening," Franklin said. "Not all at once, but it's starting." Monique looked at him, the lines around her eyes tight from focus, not fatigue. "Pressure doesn't shatter stone," she replied. "It finds the weak points, and then it waits." A janitor passed by, pushing a mop bucket, wheels squeaking slightly as he moved. He nodded at Franklin, slow and respectful. Franklin returned the gesture. In that brief exchange, two men, two witnesses, to a world that rarely noticed either of them, there was something grounding, something real. No words, no applause. Just a moment where truth passed silently between hands that carried it. Back inside the courtroom, Ramsey returned after a full 10 minutes longer than usual, and the room tensed when he walked through the chamber door. His robe shifted awkwardly on his shoulders as he sat. No one mentioned it, but Franklin saw it. So did Monique, and so, he suspected, did the jury. The next witness took the stand, but the testimony, though clear, now existed under a new shadow. Every fact offered by the prosecution was greeted not with acceptance, but with quiet evaluation, as if the jurors were now asking themselves not only what was being said, but what was being left out. Monique didn't interrupt. She let the testimony unfold, her eyes calm, her notes sparse. She wasn't preparing to respond. She was letting it settle. And Ramsey, for all his usual interruptions, for all his clipped corrections and procedural authority, said less than expected. He asked no clarifying questions, he made no sharp remarks. He simply watched, and the stillness in his eyes didn't look like authority anymore. It looked like containment. When the session ended for the day, Franklin didn't move right away. He sat still, his hands folded over the documents in front of him, his gaze not on the judge, but on the jury. They were filing out now, quiet, purposeful, and not looking at anyone directly. But one juror, the woman who had kept her pen moving since the beginning, paused just long enough to meet Franklin's eyes. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. But her face held something that hadn't been there before. Not sympathy. Not pity. Recognition. Monique began packing her notes, methodical and unhurried. Franklin stood, his knees popping softly with age and effort, and looked around the room one last time before stepping out. The air felt different now. Thicker, maybe, more aware of itself. And in that air, in the way people walked more carefully and spoke more softly, he could feel it, a crack in the armor. Small, subtle, but real. And real, Franklin had learned, is where everything begins. Sometimes the weight of injustice isn't felt in one moment. It's built slowly, case by case, verdict by verdict, until it lives in the bones of a place like the creak of old floorboards, or the way sunlight never quite reaches the far corners. of a courtroom. That morning, Franklin sat with his hands folded over a stack of documents Monique had prepared late into the night, each one a quiet monument to someone who never got to sit at the defense table and fight back. Names typed in faded ink, charges that didn't make sense, sentences that stretched far beyond what the crime, if there was one, could justify. The room filled slowly, jurors taking their seats with less urgency, but more attention, as though some unseen layer had peeled back and made the space feel less sterile and more human. The bailiff's voice echoed through the chamber as he called the court to order, but it was softer than usual, as if even he felt something different had settled in the room. Judge Ramsey appeared from chambers, moving briskly but not with the same sharpness, his eyes less certain, his face composed but tight around the edges. He tapped the gavel with habitual authority, but the sound lacked its usual bite. Monique rose without rushing, her notes in one hand, the other resting on the edge of the table like she was bracing for more than just gravity. She walked slowly to the lectern, looked at the jury first, not the judge, and spoke in a voice that carried not force but something steadier. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, "we have talked at length about this case, about evidence, about footage, but we haven't talked about pattern. Not speculation, not theory, but the quiet, relentless repetition of something we've been taught not to see unless it's caught on camera." She held up a document, not to wave it, not to perform, but to let it exist in the space. "This is a case summary from 1997, a man named Elijah Banks, Vietnam veteran, charged with felony obstruction after attempting to record his neighbor's wrongful eviction, served 10 years after evidence was deemed inconclusive." She set it down gently, then lifted another. "This one, Jamal Thomas, 23, arrested during a peaceful protest in 2002. Witnesses testified he was walking away. Security footage lost in transfer. Judge Ramsey presided. Sentence 7 years. She laid it beside the first and then another and another until the table in front of her looked less like a legal station and more like a shrine, not to victims but to survivors who had been erased from the record by nothing more than procedure and power. "We are not here to relive the past," she said finally, "but the past is not done with us just because we choose not to look at it." Franklin watched from the defense table, his breath slow, his eyes heavy with more than fatigue. Every name she spoke echoed like a drumbeat from someplace he'd lived too long: the county jail visiting room where families spoke through scratched glass, the funeral home where a wrongfully convicted man had his hands folded with a public defender's card still in his wallet. This wasn't just about memory, it was about repair. Judge Ramsey shifted in his chair, the leather creaking faintly beneath him. His hands were clasped, now tighter than before, fingers interlocked like someone holding onto something they couldn't name. "Miss Pierce," he said, "while the court acknowledges your effort to contextualize the record, I must remind you again that—" She cut in gently, not defiantly, just firmly. "Context is not a luxury, Your Honor. It's the difference between a verdict and a mistake." There was no outrage in her tone, just clarity, the kind that doesn't ask to be believed but demands not to be ignored. The jury didn't flinch. Some leaned forward. One juror removed her glasses, wiped them slowly, then placed them back with more care than before. Monique returned to her seat, leaving the files stacked like bricks, not to build a wall but a foundation. Franklin leaned toward her. "You think they'll listen?" he asked, his voice low, worn thin from years of hoping against instinct. Monique exhaled through her nose, her gaze still fixed on the papers. "They already are," she said. "They just don't know it yet." The gallery behind them remained still, but there was a different energy now, less passive, more alert. People weren't watching a trial anymore. They were witnessing something shift, not a storm, a tide. Across the aisle, the prosecutor sat frozen, his pen hovering above a notepad he hadn't touched in 10 minutes. His earlier confidence, slick and sure, now looked more like armor that had been polished too long to notice the rust beneath. The judge called for a 5-minute recess, though no one had requested it. He stood from the bench slower this time, his hands smoothing the front of his robe, not from dignity, but from habit, like a man trying to remind himself of the costume he wore before stepping back on stage. He disappeared behind the door with no further comment. Franklin didn't move. He sat with his fingers resting on the table, feeling the vibration of everything that hadn't been said but now somehow existed in the room anyway. The names, the sentences, the silence that had stretched across 3 decades now, cracked not by force but by persistence. A quiet filled the space where the judge had been, and it wasn't tension, it wasn't fear. It was awareness, raw and real, like when you finally turn on the lights in a room you haven't entered for years and realize the dust wasn't the only thing hiding there. Monique stood again, not because she had to, but because some moments ask you to stand even when nothing's happening. She looked toward the jury once more, her posture relaxed, her voice calm. "Justice," she said softly, "doesn't just fail in dramatic moments. It fails in routine, in what we allow to go unchecked, in who we stop listening to." Then she sat down, and for a long moment no one said anything. But something in the room had changed. For good, there's a silence in every courtroom that has nothing to do with order, a deeper quiet that settles in when something honest is about to break through the surface. That's what it felt like as the door at the back of the courtroom opened and a man stepped in who wasn't wearing a suit, wasn't holding a briefcase, and didn't look like he belonged anywhere near the front of the room. He walked with the quiet posture of someone used to being overlooked, a slight hitch in his step that might have gone unnoticed if you weren't paying attention, and most people weren't, at least not yet. Monique rose from her seat as he entered her gaze, softening her hand, resting momentarily on the edge of the table for balance, not out of uncertainty but out of respect. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "the defense calls Mr. Luis Estrada to the stand." There was a shift in the room, not dramatic but noticeable, like a breeze through an open window in a house that hadn't felt air in days. Judge Ramsey raised an eyebrow, his voice skeptical. "The witness wasn't on your original list." Monique nodded. "He came forward voluntarily after hearing this trial was underway. He was present during the incident in question and has a sworn statement. The court has the discretion to admit him under exception." Ramsey didn't reply at first. His gaze moved slowly from Monique to the man standing near the aisle, tan jacket, work boots, hands folded in front of him like someone taught early in life not to fidget when being watched. "Proceed," the judge said finally, though the word landed with the weight of reluctant permission. Luis approached the witness stand, without hesitation, moving deliberately, one foot slightly, dragging behind the other, the evidence of old labor injuries showing in his joints more than in his expression. When he sat, the bailiff administered the oath, and Luis repeated the words without stumbling, not because they were familiar but because they mattered. Monique approached gently, as if not to startle the truth out of him, but to welcome it forward. "Mr. Estrada," she began, "can you tell us where you were on the afternoon of the 14th of July? He nodded once, voice quiet but steady. "I was sweeping the sidewalk on Marlin Street. That's my corner. I keep it clean 6 days a week." She offered a small smile. "And were you there when my father was arrested?" His eyes flicked toward Franklin, brief, respectful, almost protective. "I was," he said. There was no movement in the room. Even the prosecutor had stopped flipping through his notes. Luis shifted slightly in his seat, his hand curling loosely around the side of the witness stand. "It happened fast," he said. "There was a police cruiser already parked, and the officer was shouting at a woman. She wasn't yelling back. She just had her hands up saying something I couldn't hear. And then he grabbed her. He paused there not for effect, just to breathe. That's when Mr. Pierce stepped in." "What did he do exactly?" Monique asked, voice softened, guiding him through it. Luis looked toward the jury now, not trying to convince them, just trying to be clear. He put himself between her and the officer. Didn't hit anyone, didn't raise his voice, just stood there with his hands out like this. He held them up, open-palmed, slow, like he was saying, "Don't." Then the officer shoved him. He didn't shove back. But he fell, and when he got up they put cuffs on him like he was the one causing trouble. Someone in the gallery drew in a breath too sharply, and the sound echoed longer than it should have. Monique took a step back, giving space to the stillness that followed. "Did you capture this on video?" she asked. Luis nodded. "I did. But the officer saw me filming, told me I had to delete it. I didn't argue. I just acted like I did." He reached slowly into his pocket, pulled out an old phone, scratched, slightly cracked, the kind of device no one would suspect had anything valuable left on it, and held it out. "But I saved the original. It's on here." The prosecutor stood quickly, raising his voice for the first time all morning. "Your Honor, we object to this sudden introduction of new digital evidence." Monique turned calmly. "It's not new, it's primary, and it directly contradicts the prosecution's narrative." Ramsey held up a hand, his voice slower now. "The court will review it. Continue." Luis's hands trembled slightly as he handed the phone to the bailiff, who brought it forward like something holy. The screen flickered to life, and Monique plugged it into the courtroom's monitor. For the first time in days, what they all argued about played out in real time, no edits, no jump cuts, no assumptions, just truth captured at a street corner on an ordinary day by a man no one thought would matter. The video ended, and no one moved. Luis looked toward Franklin once more. He didn't want to be a hero, he said softly. He just didn't want someone else to get hurt. Monique returned to her table in silence. She didn't need to say anything. The footage had spoken. Luis remained in the witness chair, eyes forward, posture steady, hands now resting quietly in his lap like someone who had finally been allowed to lay something down after holding it for far too long. Franklin watched him, and in that gaze was something that passed beyond gratitude. It was recognition, the kind of silent bond built between two men who knew what it meant to speak only when it counted most. The judge didn't speak for a full 30 seconds. He just stared at the screen, now blank again, as if the echo of what had been shown was louder than anything left to say. When the session adjourned, there was no announcement, no theatrics, just the slow shuffle of chairs and footsteps, and a truth that had finally found its way into the room. And Luis Estrada, quiet as he came, rose from the stand and walked back toward the gallery, not as a janitor, not as a footnote, but as the witness who changed everything. The room had settled, but not in the way people expect when something is resolved, not with closure, not with ease, but with the heavy stillness that follows after a truth too big to ignore has been laid bare. The screen had gone dark again, but its silence felt louder than anything said so far. Luis Estrada had returned to the gallery, folding into a wooden bench with the quiet dignity of someone who had never asked to be seen but had stepped forward anyway. The jury hadn't looked at him directly, but something in their posture had changed, less guarded, more present, as if what they'd just witnessed had quietly realigned the way they listened. Franklin sat still, hands resting flat on the table now, not clenched, not folded, just open, like a man who no longer needed to brace for every word that came his way. Monique stood beside him, her notes untouched for the last hour, her eyes on the judge, but her mind somewhere else, somewhere more deliberate, more final. There was a tension in her shoulders, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of what she was about to bring forward. She glanced toward Franklin. He didn't speak, but he gave the smallest nod, and that was enough. She reached into her briefcase again, slowly, carefully, like someone retrieving something sacred. What she pulled out wasn't large, just another manila envelope, but even the way she held it seemed to alter the atmosphere of the room. This one was thicker than the first, its corners sharper, its seal intact, and bearing a federal insignia embossed in deep blue. She laid it gently on the table and took a breath before standing tall. "Your Honor," she said, her voice smooth but resolute, "the defense moves to present additional evidence obtained through an ongoing federal investigation into judicial conduct, specifically as it pertains to financial records and institutional correspondence previously undisclosed to this court." The judge raised his eyes, his expression unreadable. "Another envelope, Miss Pierce?" He asked, the words dry, almost dismissive. "Yes," she said, steady, "but this one doesn't contain statements. It contains signatures." There was no immediate objection, no sharp interruption, only the soft creak of a wooden bench as someone shifted in the gallery. Monique opened the envelope with the same careful motion as before and removed 3 sheets of paper, each one marked, stamped, authenticated. She walked toward the monitor but didn't use it. Instead, she approached the clerk's table and handed the documents directly to the bailiff. "These," she explained, "are transaction records showing wire transfers made to accounts controlled by Southeast Incarceration Holdings, LLC. The judge leaned back slightly. "This is already a matter of public debate. The state contracts with private facilities. It's not illegal." "It's not the contract that's in question," Monique replied. "It's the commission structure." She turned to the jury now. "These records show that Judge Ramsey received annual financial incentives directly tied to sentencing recommendations that increased time served and fast-tracked inmates to privately run facilities. 14 cases over the last decade show patterns aligning with those incentives." A murmur spread through the gallery, low, stunned, restrained. The judge didn't interrupt it this time. Franklin looked at the jurors, not one by one but as a whole, and for the first time he saw them not as people judging him, but as people awakening to the system that had already judged them long before they entered that room. Monique continued, her voice calm. "The second document is a series of internal emails between court staff and the district attorney's office outlining a directive to deprioritize body camera footage when the defendant is classified as high risk based solely on zip code. and prior arrest, not conviction. She let that sit in the air for a moment, not hammering it, just holding it where everyone could see it clearly. The third document, she added, her voice now just slightly quieter, is a signed letter dated last year from a former court clerk who resigned after being instructed to misfile defense motions that referenced racial bias in sentencing. The clerk is currently under witness protection and has given a sworn statement to the U.S. Department of Justice. Ramsey's face didn't move, but something in his posture had not much but enough for Franklin to notice. The judge wasn't sitting back in his chair now. He was leaning forward, elbows slightly bent, fingers steepled, not in thought but in tension. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but stopped himself. Monique watched him quietly and then said, "This court has demanded silence from witnesses for decades. I won't be one of them." No one said a word. Even the prosecutor sat frozen, the pen in his hand, now idle, as if writing anything in this moment would feel too much like erasure. Monique returned to the defense table and laid the envelope, now empty, beside the first. The two sat there like sentinels, silent but unmovable. Franklin leaned in slightly and whispered, "That last document, is it really signed?" She looked at him and nodded once. "In blue ink. Full name. No initials. No redactions." The gavel didn't come down. The judge didn't call for order. He just looked down at the documents and for a long time said nothing. The jury, meanwhile, remained still, and in that stillness was something that hadn't been there before. Not just attention, not just concern. It was resolve taking shape quietly, like a tide beginning to pull back before a wave. Franklin's eyes drifted to the window outside. The sky had begun to clear, pale light cutting through the haze that had sat over the courthouse for days. He thought of his brother again, and his father, and all the names they'd both carried on their backs. Men who never had envelopes to open, who never had voices willing to speak their names in a courtroom. The moment didn't feel like victory. It didn't even feel like confrontation. It felt like a door opening slowly without fanfare, but with the weight of 1,000 hands finally pushing it from the other side. The judge cleared his throat but didn't look up. And Franklin, for the first time since the trial began, let himself sit back, open his palms again, and breathe, not in fear, not in defense, but in something closer to truth. There are moments when a room stops being a courtroom and becomes something else, entirely, something older, something heavier, something closer to judgment than law. And that moment came without warning. No raised voice, no last-minute confession, no sweeping declaration. Just a knock, firm, deliberate, and echoing through the marble chamber like the sound of consequence finally arriving where it always belonged. Judge Ramsey froze, not dramatically, not visibly, but with the kind of stillness that says more than motion ever could. He was mid-sentence, reciting a procedural clarification that no one had asked for, and when the knock rang out across the room, his words cut off mid-breath. For a second it was almost nothing, a tap on a wooden door, maybe someone delivering files late. But then it came again, louder, followed by the sound of a latch turning from the inside. All eyes shifted toward the main entrance. The doors to courtroom 2B opened with the slow, controlled grace of people who were not in a hurry because they were not afraid. The first to enter was a man in a dark blue suit, tall, square-shouldered, his badge glinting faintly beneath the collar of his jacket. He walked with authority, not arrogance, scanning the room with the sharp stillness of someone trained to read a space in full before saying a single word. Behind him walked a woman in her 30s, crisp black blazer folder tucked beneath one arm, her steps quieter but no less firm. The courtroom, for the first time that day, made no sound at all. The jury didn't shift. The gallery didn't whisper. Even the clerk's pen, which had been tapping softly against a notepad for most of the morning, came to an abrupt stop. The man stepped forward, standing at the midpoint between the gallery and the bench, and spoke with a clarity that needed no volume. "Judge Clayton E. Ramsey," he said, not as a question, not as a warning, just a statement of fact. "By federal directive, you are now under active investigation for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and violations of civil rights under Title 18. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Ramsey didn't speak. Not at first. His gaze shifted slightly, barely perceptible, toward the side door near his chambers, the one he had entered from so many times without being questioned. Then he looked toward the court officers near the rear wall, two men in uniform who had worked with him for years, maybe decades. He didn't speak to them directly, but something in his expression asked the question clearly, "Do something." Neither moved. The silence pressed deeper, not tense, not theatrical, just thick like air being pushed through a space that had been sealed too long. The female agent opened the folder in her hand and began to read from the top sheet. Her voice was calm, legal, and unmistakably final. This warrant is issued by the United States District Court, Southern District, under seal number 19-4421B. The subject is to be remanded into custody for preliminary questioning and evidentiary processing. All privileges of office are suspended pending federal review. Still, Ramsey didn't move. He stared at the agents as if they might change their minds if he held his position long enough. When that didn't happen, he reached slowly, almost instinctively, for his phone beside the bench, lifting it with one hand thumb already pressing against the screen. No one stopped him. No one needed to. He dialed. 1 ring, 2, 3. Voicemail. He stared at the screen for a beat longer, then tried again. Same result. The agents waited. So did everyone else. Finally, Ramsey looked at the bailiff, the same man who had called court into order every morning for 10 years. "Get them out," Ramsey said, his voice low, directed not at the agents but at the bailiff, like he was issuing an internal command from a world that no longer responded to his voice. The bailiff didn't move. Instead, he looked away, eyes settling somewhere near the floor. The two agents stepped forward together. For a moment, there was no resistance, no words, no action, just the quiet understanding of a man realizing that the robe on his shoulders was no longer a shield, and the bench beneath his hands no longer a throne. The cuffs came next. They didn't snap loudly. They clicked into place with a soft metallic finality, cold and unmistakable. Ramsey flinched slightly more out of memory than protest, as if some part of him couldn't believe what was happening, even as he felt the steel close around his wrists. His hands dropped slightly, fingers twitching just once, then going still. Monique sat motionless at the defense table, her hands resting lightly on the armrests of her chair. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The room was already saying everything for her. Franklin didn't smile. He didn't lean back or sigh or show any visible release. He just sat there watching, his eyes fixed, not on Ramsey, but on the moment itself, as if this was less about one man falling and more about something larger being recognized finally for what it really was. The agents began escorting Ramsey down the center aisle, past the jury, past the gallery, past the people who had once stood when he entered, and now watched in stunned silence as he passed them without ceremony. His robe had slipped slightly at the shoulder one side, drooping, exposing the crisp white collar beneath. No one reached to fix it. As he reached the rear of the courtroom, one of the older court officers stepped aside, not with shame, not with malice, just with the tired grace of someone who understood that a chapter was closing. And in that instant, just before Ramsey crossed the threshold, he turned his head not to look back, not to plead, but to see if anyone was still following him. No one was. And that was the truth. Not the kind printed in transcripts or preserved in exhibits, but the kind that lingers in a room long after the doors close behind it. A silence that isn't empty. A silence that knows the difference between power and justice. Franklin looked down at his hands, open, steady, still. For the first time in weeks, they weren't shaking. And that was enough. The holding cell wasn't much, a narrow rectangle lined with dull gray concrete and a stainless steel bench bolted into the wall like an afterthought. Overhead, a single fluorescent bulb flickered slightly, humming at intervals, as if deciding whether to stay on or surrender to darkness. The temperature was neither cold nor warm, but the kind of indifferent chill that seeps into your clothes, reminding you that comfort no longer belongs to you. And there, in the middle of it all, sat Judge Clayton Ramsey, hands resting on his knees back, slightly hunched eyes, fixed not on the wall but on nothing in particular. He wasn't in cuffs anymore. The agents had removed them before they locked the door, but the faint red impressions on his wrists remained like bracelets made of time. His robe was gone too, taken the moment he was processed, folded carelessly by someone who didn't care that it had once ruled over men's futures. He still wore the same shirt and tie underneath, but without the robe they looked ordinary, like a costume missing its final piece. And maybe that's all it ever was, a costume carefully worn, perfectly pressed, until the stage gave out beneath him. He hadn't spoken since the door clicked shut. No demands, no questions, no instructions barked into the silence. Just breathing slow, shallow, with pauses, long enough to feel deliberate. It was the sound of a man beginning to understand that silence once wielded as power was now the only thing left answering him. The corridor outside was quiet except for the distant echo of footsteps and the occasional click of a latch opening on another cell. No one hurried. There was no rush. The building didn't buzz with scandal or swarm with press. This wasn't the kind of fall that came with headlines and flashbulbs. It was quieter, sadder, heavier. A few minutes passed. Or maybe longer. Time didn't move in the same way here. Then the outer door creaked open and another set of footsteps entered, measured, confident, unaccompanied. Ramsey didn't look up right away. He just listened. And when the figure stepped into view, there was a long pause between them, not tense, not confrontational, just quiet. It was Judge Ronald Greaves, retired now, white-haired, slightly stooped, but still carrying that old posture of a man who had once been the system's trusted spine. He didn't speak at first, just glanced around the cell like a tourist returning to a town he used to call home but now barely recognized. Then he looked at Ramsey and let out a breath that was somewhere between disbelief and regret. "You remember when we used to say justice was a straight line?" Greaves asked, voice low but clear. Ramsey didn't respond. "I used to think you were the one keeping it straight," Greaves continued. "Turns out I just wasn't looking closely enough." Ramsey's eyes finally lifted, not defiant, not bitter, just tired. "You think this is what justice looks like?" he asked. Greaves shrugged, folding his hands in front of him. "I think this is what happens when people forget what the word means." The silence that followed wasn't sharp. It was weighted, familiar. The kind that lives between two people who know there's nothing left to argue about. Ramsey leaned back against the wall, his shoulders touching the cold concrete. "You followed me for years," he said. "You backed every ruling, every sentence." "I did," Greaves admitted, "and I'll carry that. But I never took money. I never threw out testimony just to keep my docket moving." There was no venom in his tone, no gloating, just truth finally placed between them, like a file that couldn't be closed. Ramsey lowered his gaze. "I didn't think it would end like this," he said. Greaves let the words settle. Nobody ever does. He stood for another moment as if waiting for something else to come, but nothing did. So he turned slowly, walking back toward the door with quiet, deliberate steps. And before he left, he paused again and said almost to himself, "The robe was never meant to protect us. It was meant to remind us who we serve." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and Ramsey was alone again. Only this time the silence didn't feel like insulation. It felt like inventory. He looked around the cell, taking in the scratched paint on the wall where a previous inmate had tried to mark the days. The floor was scuffed, and the bench beneath him bore the initials of someone who had come through years before. For the first time, he realized how many men he had sent into places just like this, and how rarely he had imagined what it felt like on the other side of the bench. His breathing slowed again, but there was no peace in it, just the rhythm of a man who was no longer being listened to. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands now pressed together like in prayer, though not to ask for anything, not even forgiveness, just to hold something, anything, even if it was just himself. Outside, beyond the gray hallway, the courthouse remained standing tall, wide, historic, but no longer untouchable. And inside this small, flickering room, Clayton Ramsey, once the voice of authority, now sat quietly, as a man being remembered by the institution he thought had forgotten how. No nameplate, no bench, no robe, just a chair, a wall, and the long echo of every voice he once refused to hear. In the bowels of the courthouse, beneath the polished floors, and the weight of history that lived above the holding cell, sat quiet, tucked between a storage closet and a long corridor lined with wire-reinforced glass. The air was colder down there, not just because of the concrete, but because of what the space carried, a kind of institutional stillness that didn't just hold people but waited with them, echoing every footstep like it might be the last before something changed for good. Clayton Ramsey sat alone on the bench, no longer a judge, no longer a voice that could silence a room, just a man in a pressed shirt with his sleeves, now rolled up collar wilted from hours without air conditioning, and an expression that had stopped trying to appear composed. He had removed his tie earlier, folded it neatly beside him like a soldier taking off the last piece of a uniform that no longer served a purpose. His hands were clasped loosely between his knees, fingers laced thumbs, twitching every so often, not out of fear but out of some strange need to feel motion, to know he was still in a body that could choose what to do next, even if it no longer mattered. The door creaked open with a long metallic sigh, the kind of sound that didn't need to announce itself because it was already expected. He didn't look up immediately. He recognized the rhythm of the footsteps, slow, evenly spaced, not aggressive, not hesitant. When he finally raised his eyes, he saw a uniform standard county issue, faded from too many washes, the shoulder patch barely holding its color. The woman wearing it looked to be in her 40s, hair pulled back tightly, jaw set, not in judgment, but in the kind of fatigue that comes from carrying too many long nights on short notice. She stood in the doorway for a moment, not to stare, not to intimidate, but simply to observe like someone who knew the difference between watching and seeing. Then, without raising her voice, she said, "You once told me justice had to be harsh." Her voice wasn't bitter, it was level, thoughtful. "Today I think I finally understand. Justice also needs to know when to bow its head." Ramsey looked at her long and quiet, the way a man might look at a mirror he'd been avoiding for years. He didn't reply, and she didn't wait for one. She stepped inside, set a small paper cup of water on the edge of the bench beside him, and turned to leave. "It's a long night," she added, as she stepped through the threshold. "Thought you might want something before intake." Then she was gone, her footsteps fading down the corridor, the same way they had come, without rush, without noise, without needing to linger. He stared at the cup for a while before touching it. The rim was already damp with condensation, a single drop trailing down its side, leaving a dark line across the bench. It was ordinary disposable, probably filled from a hallway cooler, but in that moment it felt heavier than any gavel he'd ever held. He picked it up slowly, both hands wrapped around it like he wasn't holding water, but something older, something thinner than control. Maybe humility, maybe the echo of a lesson that came too late to pass down. His thoughts drifted back, not to the courtroom, not to the arrest, but to a moment years ago, in his second year on the bench, when a young defendant had stood trembling in front of him with shoes that didn't match, and a lawyer who looked as lost as he did. The boy had said, "I didn't mean to run," and Ramsey had answered, "Intent is irrelevant when the law is clear." He had ruled quickly, sentencing him to 18 months without probation, not out of malice but efficiency. There had been 10 cases that day. He'd told himself it was about maintaining order. Now he wasn't so sure what that word had ever meant. He sipped the water slowly, the coolness settling in his throat in a way that reminded him he hadn't spoken aloud in hours. Words had once been his trade, polished, rehearsed, commanding, and now they sat like unused tools at the bottom of a box he no longer had the key for. He tried to say something then, quietly, just to himself, maybe to the walls. But no sound came out. He stopped trying after the second attempt. Outside the cell, another door opened and closed, the echo carried faintly across the empty corridor. Somewhere above a hallway, phone rang once and didn't ring again. And inside, Ramsey shifted slightly on the bench, stretching his legs just far enough to feel the weight of his body press into the floor. There was no clock in the cell, but the air felt later than it had when he arrived. Time no longer ticked in minutes, but in realizations, the slow unfurling of a truth he'd spent years ignoring because it had never applied to him until now. A robe can shield you from questions. It can give weight to your silence. But once it's gone, what's left isn't just a man without power, it's a man with nothing left to hide behind. He glanced toward the corner of the room where the cinder-block wall met the floor in a seam, barely visible in the dim light. Someone long ago had etched a single word there with what looked like a key or maybe a nail. Listen, just that. No date, no initials, just a verb. He stared at it for a long time. And then finally he closed his eyes, not to sleep, not to rest, but simply to stop seeing everything at once. And in the stillness that followed, there was no judgment, no gavel, no robe, only the faint hum of the overhead light, and the quiet sound of a man beginning at last to sit inside the silence he once controlled. When Franklin stepped outside the courthouse, the light had changed not just in color or direction, but in weight. The sky was overcast, soft gray, bleeding into pale blue, and the clouds held a quiet, steady motion, like they were moving not out of urgency but release. He paused at the top of the stone steps, letting the wind find his collar, feeling the air on his skin like something he hadn't truly felt in weeks. There was no crowd, no reporters shouting questions, no camera flashes, just people standing or walking in small clusters, talking in low voices or watching with a kind of still respect. And for once, none of them were watching him like a man on trial. Beside him, Monique stood quietly, arms at her sides, face lifted just slightly toward the sky, as if measuring the space between breath and horizon. She didn't say anything right away, didn't fill the silence with declarations or explanations. She just stood there steady, and present her shoulders lowered, and her expression clear. Franklin looked over at her and offered a small nod, more gesture than sentence, and she returned it with the faintest of smiles, not wide, not performative, just real. A man passed by them on the sidewalk, paused briefly, then tipped his cap before continuing down the street. No words exchanged, no names spoken, but in the glance was something fuller than language. A kind of acknowledgement that only comes between people who've walked through fire and come out the other side, still willing to look others in the eye. Franklin took a breath slow and deep, the kind that opens the ribs and softens the spine. "Feels different," he said, softly, more to himself than anyone else. Monique turned to him, eyebrows raised gently. "The air." He shook his head once. "The weight," he answered, like something got set down and finally stayed down. They descended the steps slowly, each one carrying a memory, each one now free to carry something else. At the bottom, a young woman in a gray coat stepped aside, holding her phone loosely in one hand, the screen dark. She didn't speak, but the way she looked at Monique, like someone who had just witnessed a page turn, said more than any interview or article ever could. They walked without needing direction, letting their pace match the city's rhythm, which had returned to something soft and honest, like a breath that doesn't have to hold itself in anymore. Street vendors were packing up fruit stands nearby, their voices drifting like music through the open air. Traffic hummed softly a block away, and in the window of a cafe, an older couple clinked coffee mugs, with a kind of reverence, as if the small moment deserved ceremony. Monique stopped near the corner, resting her hand on the edge of a newspaper box. Inside the glass, the morning edition already bore the headline, "Judge Suspended After Explosive Trial Evidence." But the font bold as it was felt smaller than the moment. "They made it about him," she said, almost under her breath, like it started with him and ended with him. Franklin looked at the page, then away. "Let them," he said. "That way they won't see what's coming next." She looked at him then, not as a daughter, not even as an attorney, but as a woman standing beside a man who had taught her how to stand when standing mattered most. "So what now?" she asked. His gaze drifted to the skyline, to the quiet motion of the courthouse flag lowering in the soft breeze. "Now," he said, "we use the space we opened, we let light in, and we keep the door from ever closing again." They continued down the block, past storefronts, with creaky wooden signs, past families, pushing strollers, past men on benches, with newspapers folded in their laps like small shields against the cold. A voice called out from behind, an older man in a navy sweater cane resting against the bricks beside him. "You did good in there," he said, nodding once. "Didn't think anyone would." Franklin nodded in return, lifting a hand in thanks. "We didn't think we'd be allowed to," Monique added, her tone steady but not bitter. The man chuckled once. "They never allow it," he said. "That's why it matters more when you do it anyway." By the time they reached the corner, the courthouse was behind them, not forgotten, not diminished, just no longer looming. Franklin paused and turned once more to look at it the way you look at a place where something ended but didn't break. He took a final breath before stepping forward again, letting the past stay where it was. A reporter approached cautiously from the side street, voice tentative. "Mr. Pierce," she said, "do you consider this a win?" Franklin didn't answer right away. He watched a bus pass by the windows, fogged from the inside, the faces indistinct. Then he turned back to her, voice low, clear. "This isn't a win," he said. "This is a door. A heavy one, rusted at the hinges and stuck for decades. We didn't kick it in. We just found the part where it cracked. And we pushed." She didn't ask another question. She just nodded, once lowered her mic, and stepped back into the crowd, notebook tucked beneath her arm like something that could wait. Franklin turned to Monique again. "You know," he said, "I used to think justice came from the top down, from robes and rulings. But today," he paused, letting the words find their own shape. "Today it came from the floor up. From footsteps, from witnesses, from people who don't get titles in newspapers." Monique didn't respond. She didn't have to. They crossed the street together, the walk signal blinking calmly as traffic slowed to let them pass. And as their shoes touched the opposite curb, there was no cheer, no applause, just the soft sound of gravel underfoot, the quiet rhythm of two people walking forward into a world that had shifted, not loudly, not permanently, but just enough to leave a mark. And sometimes Franklin thought that's how the next chapter begins, not with a proclamation, but with the simple act of no longer needing permission to move forward. Later that evening, after the courthouse had emptied and the last of the television crews had packed their gear into vans that blended into dusk, Franklin sat alone on a bench across from the building just beyond the edge of the plaza. The sun had slipped behind a line of weathered rooftops, leaving a soft golden haze in the air, the kind of light that didn't cast shadows sharply but gently pulled them long across the pavement like ribbons of memory stretching towards nowhere in particular. The wind had calmed. The city had returned to itself, and for the first time in a long time, Franklin didn't feel like he was waiting for something to happen. His coat was folded beside him untouched, though the air had cooled. His hands rested on his knees, fingers open, palms relaxed. He wasn't tired exactly, not in the way that sleep could fix, but there was a weight that had finally shifted off his shoulders, not completely gone, but moved just enough to let breath in more deeply than before. He watched a pigeon hop near the curb pause, then flap up to the courthouse steps like it owned the place. He smiled faintly, quietly, in a way that didn't reach his lips but lived behind his eyes. A familiar pair of footsteps approached from the right, slow, steady, and unhurried. Monique didn't speak at first. She sat beside him, mirroring his posture, her hands resting lightly in her lap. They sat like that for a while, the silence between them not needing anything added to it. Just two people who had made it through something side by side without losing the rhythm that held them together. Finally, she said, "I checked the messages. We've had 7 voicemails and 3 emails from people asking for help. Most of them don't know us. One man said he found a box of his brother's trial records in his attic last year and never knew what to do with it." Franklin nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the building across the street. "Now he does," he said. Monique glanced at him. "We're not going back to normal after this, are we?" He shook his head. "There's no normal left," he replied. "And maybe that's a good thing." A city bus groaned past them, its engine sighing as it slowed at the intersection. Inside, a boy leaned against the window cheek, pressed to the glass eyes, following a bird outside like he was trying to understand how something so small could move so freely. Franklin watched the boy for a second, then returned his gaze to the courthouse, its wide stone face beginning to glow under the evening lights, not with authority anymore, just architecture. Monique leaned back, letting her shoulders sink into the bench. "Do you ever wonder how long people will remember?" she asked. "This trial, what it meant." Franklin took a long breath before answering. "Maybe a week, maybe a month. But it's not about being remembered. It's about what stays behind even when we're not looking." She tilted her head, considering his words, like what he nodded slightly toward the courthouse. "Like cracks," he said. "Small at first, quiet. But once they show, they never go away. You can paint over them. You can patch them. But they remind the foundation it's been shaken, that something's moved. And movement," he added, "is where truth gets in." A gentle wind returned, lifting a few dry leaves across the plaza. They tumbled slowly, skittering against the cement, like soft whispers being carried forward. Across the street, the lights inside the courthouse were beginning to dim. One by one, the windows blinked into shadow, but one light on the second floor, just above the courtroom, remained on, casting a narrow beam down the wall, catching the edges of a hand-carved lintel above the doors. It wasn't much, just a sliver, but it was enough to break the dark. Monique followed his gaze and smiled softly. "There it is," she said. The light through the crack. Franklin didn't respond right away. He let the moment settle into him the way old songs sometimes do when you're not expecting them. Finally, he stood up, stretching slowly, the stiffness in his legs reminding him that time was still moving, even when it felt like it had paused. "You coming?" he asked. Monique stood beside him, brushing dust from her sleeve. "Always," she said. They began to walk side by side, their steps falling into easy rhythm again, not marching, not running, just moving forward with the quiet steadiness of people who understood that progress wasn't made in leaps but in inches, in long conversations, in records dusted off and finally read in someone somewhere whispering "me too," even when no one was listening. They turned the corner, leaving the courthouse behind them, not in defiance but in peace. And though the doors had closed hours ago and the headlines would soon move on, something inside those walls had shifted for good, something that couldn't be undone. Not loud, not flashy, just true. And sometimes Franklin thought that's enough. Sometimes all it takes is a crack wide enough to let the light find its way in, and someone willing to stand there long enough, quietly enough for the world to notice. You know, some of life's most powerful lessons don't come from lectures or thick books. They come from broken silences, from ordinary people standing up to speak the truth when the whole room would rather stay quiet. This story isn't just about justice or a courtroom. It's a reminder that real change doesn't begin with applause, but with the moment someone dares to approach a door that's been locked for far too long and gives it a gentle push. For many of us, especially those who've lived through life's highs and lows, the most precious thing might not be victory, but witnessing that justice can still open, even if just a crack. And sometimes finding the courage to stand up even slowly, even late, becomes the greatest gift we leave for the next generation. If you believe stories like this need to be told more often, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who still believes in truth. Because sometimes just one voice, just one share, is enough to open a door someone else was too afraid to knock on.